Hello, this is Kenneth with the Advancing Equity Coalition, here to continue to have conversations with experts in the field about our key priorities in this upcoming school board election for Minneapolis Public Schools. And I'm super excited today to have Samara Elta here to have a conversation from the Legal Rights Center to have a conversation about student well-being. Samara, how are you doing today?
I am doing pretty well. I'm excited to chat with you.
Yeah, thank you for taking the time. So you are the year's program director at the Legal Rights Center. For folks who aren't familiar with the Legal Rights Center, for folks who aren't familiar with years and what that means, can you just give us a quick explanation of that and then your relationship with Minneapolis Public Schools?
Absolutely, yes. So yes, I am the year's program director. Our year's team stands for our Youth Education, Advocacy, and Restorative Services program here at the Legal Rights Center. And so the LRC was an organization that started back in the 1960s, really out of Black and Indigenous organizers during the Civil Rights Movement. And so a lot of that same momentum and connection to community is really still deeply embedded in our organization to this day. We are a community nonprofit, but we partner really closely with MPS in a variety of different ways, specifically on our year's team. A lot of what we do is provide restorative services, whether that be holding circle space or our family group conference process, maybe a restorative facilitated dialogue between staff or between families. We partner directly with MPS to receive referrals from all of the different schools across the district, which means that we have a lot of flexibility on our end to tailor our services to the needs of individual students, families, and school buildings. So we're really able to come in once something has happened, or as folks are really beginning to hold spaces where they're building community, to really think about how can we deeper embed the restorative mindset in these spaces, how can we allow for folks to be in relationship with one another, and how can at the end of the day we allow students and families to feel supported at MPS.
Okay, cool. Well, thanks for running through that for us, for folks who don't know about the Legal Rights Center's relationship with the district, because I think it is an important conversation and is an important partnership that the district has, especially as more folks continue to talk about, what's going on with restorative justice in Minneapolis public schools, right? Oftentimes, the district will be like, well, we're partnering with the Legal Rights Center to do that. And so it's important that folks just know who that is and also understand that Legal Rights Center is just one organization and they cannot implement restorative practices across the district for the district. So
yeah, absolutely. We are in a unique position at the LRC. We get to be a third party neutral coming into spaces where we're able to get to know the student, get to know the family, really hear what's happened or hear the impact of what's happened, and begin to do some brainstorming around what are the goals that they want to achieve throughout a restorative process. Who do we need to involve to make sure that we can reach those goals and that everyone along the way is feeling that their needs are being met. And so, as a neutral, we're able to really step in and then also step out so that the folks that are in the space are able to build that relationship or maintain that relationship while we're there, but then also be able to keep it going, moving forward, and we're able to step back out in that way.
that's awesome. So, student well-being ended up being a key priority in this conversation that we were having with community, with stakeholders, principals, teachers, families. So this ended up being a really key priority, basically because folks were recognizing that after 3 years of interrupted learning, distance learning, the uprising that clearly took place here in Minneapolis, everything was just coming to take a toll on students, right? Everyone can recognize that, and everyone knows that MPS has to play a role in addressing that in order for the academic outcomes to happen, right? In order for there to be positive cultures within buildings, right? Like we just have to confront this as a society and as a city. And unfortunately, like Minneapolis Public Schools has to bear the brunt of taking responsibility for that right now, because they're the ones that see, 28,000 students, 29,000 students every single day. So with that, and with the work that the Legal Rights Center has been doing, I'm just curious, what are some of your reflections just to share with our audience today around, like, what have you noticed about student well-being, especially with the students that you're working with who are needing some type of support in building relationships with it amongst either with their other classmates, with, something's happened with their teacher or another adult in the building. What are you noticing, and what can you share with us?
Absolutely. Yeah, I mean, you named like so much has happened that young people have had to face alongside adults over the past few years, but really thinking about as they're entering into school buildings, how we're seeing these young people still as holistic individuals that are carrying the weight of what happened blocks away, possibly from where they lived, especially in the wake of the murder of George Floyd. And so really thinking through, how are we allowing these young people to feel seen, to feel heard, and to feel that their voice is being listened to. And so that's really our belief at the Legal Rights Center. And as we approach young people and families, is to really come back to how are we ensuring that you are feeling heard in your concerns, in your needs, and what's going really well. But how are we allowing for a space that might not be traditionally one that's created for a young person to really say, hey, this isn't working for me, or I need to do this in a different way. So when we come in and we do a family group conference process, we meet with the young person, their family, and the members of the school team individually to really hear, what's been happening? What do you envision in terms of being a long-term solution or support? What do you need to make sure that we can make this a meaningful experience where this young person is able to find success and feel well supported in the school building, and really feel at the end of the day that their safety and their well-being is being taken care of. And so it really starts with allowing that young person to share their story, to share their perspective, and to really feel that they can be included and welcome into the building in a way that they truly feel that they belong and that they're being listened to. And so that's really a really primary piece of the work that we do at LRC, and also making sure that we're seeing young people from a strength-based perspective, especially students that have ongoing behavior concerns or are more disengaged in the school building. We really want to see and come back to what are the things that are going really well for you? What are some of the goals that you have in your life? What's a class that you're really good at? What do you like to do outside of school? And how can we really lean into those pieces to work through those challenges together as well?
Yeah, that's really interesting. I think really important, especially as, student well-being is, a key priority for us to be thinking about and talking to school board members, right? Is like how, or school board candidates, I should say, because like how do school board candidates create that culture, right? And especially as school board members, their role is governance, right? So they shouldn't be like totally interfering, but like what investments do they make, right? What are the things that they monitor? What are the things that they're measuring? What are the things that they hold the superintendent and expect the superintendent to hold all the principals, all the teachers accountable for, creating space for students, right? What are the structures that the school board directly is creating so that students can elevate, what is working, what isn't working. And I know that's a conversation that the school board continues to have with their student representative, trying to build a stronger partnership with citywide student government in Minneapolis Public Schools. But I think, yeah, elevating that voice for students, and then really seeing students as a whole person and not just, the academic outcome, or, just seeing them as, people who only care about academics, but have a skill set that's so much broader than that, while also understanding like that is a strategy to help support their academic attainment throughout
Absolutely.
their
Absolutely.
academic journey.
Mhm. Yeah. And I think too, a piece that you're naming too, Kenneth, is that idea of holding young people to high expectations. And that's really something that when we think about a restorative mindset and a restorative approach, those high expectations and that high accountability is still very much present, but it's also alongside that high level of support. And so I think as we think about how buildings can create, exactly like you said, that intentional space to allow for young people to feel supported, we also have to look at the relationships that underline that support and that young person in the building. So are they feeling connected to their peers in their classroom? Do they feel that they belong in the class that they're in? Especially for Black and Brown students, are they connected to most of their teachers that are going to be white? What is that level of trust that is established? What are those genuine relationships looking like in the school building? And if that isn't there, how do we need to create, again, that intentional space to make sure that we're doing that relationship building, that community building, not only one-on-one, but also within our classroom environments? And so, whether that means holding circle space to begin to get to know one another on an ongoing basis in the classroom, whether that's having conferencing or a circle dialogue to work through specific conflicts that have happened in the classroom. These are all intentional shifts that policy-wide across this different school buildings in the district are very tangible shifts that can be made within the classroom and within school buildings to really allow for that restorative framework to be underlying as opposed to the traditional punitive measures that school buildings take on a day-to-day basis currently.
Yeah, and that's such an interesting conversation around the punitive nature of schools, because I think as we also see the conversation that's taken place in Minneapolis around policing and the carceral state, or incarcerating young people of color, especially Indigenous people. You also see this reaction to the need for safety, the need for quote unquote order, whatever it might be, right? And there was it was a big deal when Minneapolis Public Schools ended their relationship with the Minneapolis Police Department, and lots of folks have had a lot of feelings and concerns in different ways about that. And I've heard even this year, right? There's been a big expectation across high schools around high school principals are setting very, very clear expectations, and maybe not focusing as much as you talked about earlier on the relationship building side of things, but more so on the here are what those high expectations are. But not, so I don't know. I think there's a lot there around the punitive natures of our schools, even though we've taken some of these steps to try to decriminalize being in school in Minneapolis Public Schools. But yeah, I'd just be curious to hear your take on what does that mean, and what does that look like, and how does that impacting students?
Absolutely. Yeah. There's a lot of underlying ways that punitive measures are showing up in school buildings outside of just suspensions and expulsions. And so,
but sorry, not to interrupt. Sorry, I don't mean to interrupt, but and the suspensions and expulsions are very, very prevalent. The disparities are huge. We should not have a conversation about student well-being without talking about the huge disparities that take place for Black, Brown, Indigenous students in suspensions and expulsions, and removing them from learning opportunities in their building, and removing them from their peers, and from, so anyways, I didn't want to gloss back that.
No, thank you. I appreciate you jumping in, because I think that absolutely is the most glaring example of how punitive measures and the punitive approach shows up in our school buildings in a very normalized way. When something happens in a school building, the first response is to have some sort of disciplinary measure that might entail a suspension or an expulsion, as opposed to doing more of a restorative approach by being able to bring folks together, have one-on-one conversations to understand why something has happened or what has led to this event happening, and then be able to really think through, what do we all need to do collectively to make sure that this doesn't happen again, as opposed to putting both that pressure and all of the really ownership on that young person to make sure that that's an action that they do not complete again. Really what the restorative approach does and how we embed relationships into supporting that student is thinking that we all have a piece in making sure that this student is successful and that they're doing well in this building, that they're feeling supported, that they're feeling that their well-being is taken cared for. And so if this student isn't being successful or isn't reflecting that, that's a reflection on all of us as a community as well. And so really thinking through directly, how are we allowing those relationships and that accountability that we have to one another to also make sure that that student's well-being is being taken care for. And so, yes, I appreciate you highlighting the presence of suspensions and expulsions, because I think in our work, that's a really prevalent example where we're seeing, okay, the student was kicked out of the classroom, but then what? How are we welcoming them back into the building? How are we sitting down with them to think through, what was the impact of this on you? What are your relationships looking like with the other kids in your class? What do you need to be able to make sure that something like this doesn't happen again? And it's almost always in the work that we do, you're having conversations with the student and the family where you're learning that it wasn't just one isolated event, but this student or this family might have 10 other things that are happening that might be allowing for this event to happen. And so how are we making sure that some of those needs are being met? And how are we making sure that the adults in the building are being accountable to making sure that the student's well-being is being taken care of?
Yeah. And so I think, again, trying to pull this back, this is such an interesting conversation. We could go in so many different ways with this. But I think, trying to pull this back into the conversation around school board and school board candidates in Minneapolis public schools, really thinking critically about like, what do these candidates think about the culture of our buildings, the punitive nature in our buildings? What type of investments do they want to make? Do they think they can convince others to make with them? Right? Because, again, the board can only act as one. An individual school board member can't just take action independently. So they have to do this work together. Are they all on board to, holding adults accountable to creating that welcoming, nurturing environment, to, create relationships? And how do they hold everybody accountable for that? And we're asking schools to do a lot. And we know that we're asking schools to do a lot, but that's because right now our students need a lot and our students deserve everything. Right. And so I think that's an important conversation to have. So I don't know, Samara, is there anything that you would like to add before we wrap in terms of like student well-being? Because I do think this conversation, we don't have this conversation enough about student well-being, especially in the ways that you're talking about it. So is there anything that you'd like to add before we close out?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's really right that we don't have this conversation enough. And I think that that's a really evident example of why we need to have it more. Our students know better than anyone what they need to be successful and to feel supported. And so they're the first people that we need to go to ask those questions around, where do we need to be? What do you want to see in your school building? We hold circles in a variety of different schools across the district, and right away, as you sit down with a young person and every person is giving the opportunity to share, they can name right away what are the things that are getting in the way of their success in school. Their children are incredibly honest and transparent, and they right away can say, this is a barrier for me. And so it's up to us as adults and with school policies to be able to meet those barriers. So if a student is naming that their mental health is really a primary concern, how are we making sure that we're providing them with adequate resources, connections, adults in the building that are making sure that this student's mental health is being prioritized? And so I think that's really not only do we need to look at the relationships that are in place, but we need to look directly to the young people to tell us what they need first, because I really do think that just can directly impact the culture of our buildings, the policies that surround our district. I think that the young people know best and really are able to articulate what they need to feel that their well-being is being prioritized in the building.
Yeah, I as you're sharing that, I was thinking about, yeah, how can we create the infrastructure to adequately support,
Mhm.
you know, school buildings and being responsive to what students are identifying they need, right?
Right.
Like it takes a level of flexibility at the school,
Mhm.
at the building level to be responsive to like what are the immediate needs. But we also need to make sure that there's an infrastructure that can handle like that level of flexibility, right? Because and
Absolutely.
so, I think a lot of times we also talk about, and especially in Minneapolis, things are top down. Things really
Mhm.
feel, like they're said at Davis Center and they need to happen in buildings.
Yeah.
Um, but also like buildings need the support of Davis Center in order to provide
Mhm.
some of the things that you're talking about, like the mental health supports. And we can get into a whole thing about that because I know that is a defining
Mhm.
characteristic around what people are thinking about right now in terms of what is student well-being.
Right.
um, and we know that the school board needs, this district and the school board need to understand what is the scope of the needs right now, because I think we're
Mhm.
all you know guessing a little bit based on
Yeah.
some of the behavioral outcomes or the academic outcomes that are taking place. But I think we need to figure out a way to assess that, monitor that, and then figure out what investment needs to take place in order to meet the needs right now. Because
Mhm.
I think we've been hearing from students for a long time that they haven't been met before the pandemic. And
Mhm.
now that we're entering school year number 3 or 4, I can't even count
Yeah.
anymore.
Mhm.
That just hasn't gotten any better. So
Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah. And creating the systems and structures around that. I think that's one thing that really, as the work that we do at LRC, as we're building into, we're having these conversations on an individual level with a student, with a principal, but then how can this one incident really also maybe impact what else is happening in the building? How can we learn from this one experience around what this student needed and what this family needed to inform the practices that we do in our individual buildings and across the district as well. So again, really leaning into that student voice, and really allowing for students to build relationships in ways that they often aren't, as they're coming in to math class and leaving language arts, but really creating intentional space during the day where folks are able to connect with their peers and with the adults in the building.
awesome. Well, Samara, thank you so much for the time today. I've learned a lot. I hope folks that have tuned in have learned as much as I did. But just as a reminder for folks, this is another key priority in a series of key priorities that we have for you all to consider when you're voting for school board this year. And so, again, as a reminder, that those key priorities are academics, teachers of color, student well-being, multicultural learner or multilingual learners, special education, and financial management. So as you're going to the polls, as you're considering who you want to represent you on the school board, be thinking about those issues. You can check out some of our other videos if you want to learn more about any topic. We are trying to put out as many resources as possible to make this whole process easy, but this school board election is important. So make sure you take the time to really consider who you're voting for and what are the issues that they stand on, especially these issues that impact students of color and Indigenous students most closely. So with that, Tamara, thank you for helping us create another
Thank
resource for folks
you.
as they go and vote. And I just really appreciate your time.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, bye.